The fact that black people are able and willing to stomach abuse by white people but react violently at any hint, real or imagined, of disrespect by other black people is a form of mental illness. Frantz Fanon wrote the following with reference to Algeria in his book, The Wretched of the Earth. Quote, "While the settler or the policeman has the right the lifelong day to strike the native, to insult him, and to make him crawl to him, you will see the native reaching for his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive glance cast on him by another native. The native's last resort is to defend his personality vis-a-vis his own brother. In other words, the anger which they cannot act out on the white man, on the white woman, they act it out on those who look like them. It's a mental disease which we have to deal with."
In a world where Africans have lost their roots, it has become of vital importance to document our ways. In an effort to reverse the brainwashing of the past, where we were made to believe our ways are demonic, we are pressed to create dignified and respectful platforms to unpack our spiritual ways. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or position of this channel, its hosts, or affiliates. This podcast is a platform for open discussions and exploration of various perspectives, including controversial and unconventional ideas. We encourage viewers to think critically, do their own research, and form their own opinions. The content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be taken as fact, advice, or an endorsement of any specific viewpoint. Viewers' discretion is advised. Umoya Ulight, Umoya Upright, thank you for joining us for another episode with Ntate MANDLA SELEOANE.
Thank you, Ntsigi, for having me once again. I appreciate it highly. The last time I was here, we spoke about Steve Biko. Today, we shall speak about Utatu Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe. I have titled the discussion of today, Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe, a name which has defied organized loss of memory. By way of introduction, let me just say, I think it is important to explain why at this point in time it is important to remind ourselves about Utatu Sobukwe. We have arrived at a point in the evolution of South African society where black people more and more are wondering whether liberation was worthwhile. A point where black people are wondering whether other black people can be trusted to run the country without running it down, can be trusted to run the country without being corrupt. Now, when people arrive at the place that we have arrived at in South Africa, it is very easy to slide into dangerous political thoughts. When the path of freedom becomes too steep and you are ravaged by the pains of hunger, unemployment, high cost of living, dark nights because of load shedding, roads which are decorated with potholes at every turn, when the outlines of society are defined by lawlessness and we are not safe even in our homes, it is tempting to think back about how better things were in the past. It is easy to slip into back and glorify slavery. But I want to suggest that it is at times like this exactly where we have to dig deep into our history and inquire whether it was inevitable that we should wind down where we have wound down. I want to suggest that it is at times like these exactly that we should search the dark corners of our memory and ask what the liberation struggle was ever about. And in doing so, we should find the courage to speak straight and not mince our words. Who was Sobukwe? Sobukwe was born on the 5th of December 1924 in Graafrenet in the Eastern Cape. Like so many of us, he came from a humble family. His father, Hubert, was a stores clerk and a part-time tree cutter. His mother, Angelina, was a domestic worker. Mangaliso was raised in the Methodist Church. In 1947, he went to Fort Hare, and at the time Fort Hare was not the autonomous university that it is today. It was a university college of the University of South Africa. He registered in 1947 for a BA degree, and he majored in isiXhosa, in native administration, and in English. Now I must take a pause here in order to make a point. Many years after 1947, white academics teaching black students at tertiary institutions had an inclination to encourage black students to study subjects like native or Bantu administration. Their rationale for that, sometimes it was subtle, sometimes it was not so subtle, but their rationale was that this would help in the management of other black people. So it was necessary to teach us things like native or Bantu administration so that we could better manage our own people in their interests, not in our interests. Now, this was certainly the case still in 1972 when I enrolled for a law degree at the University of the North, presently called University of Limpopo. Now, Ngugi wa Thiong'o once made a remark to the effect that anthropology was conceived in sin, but that it had had unintended consequences. When Sobukwe went to Fort Hare in 1947, was it 46 or 47 now? 47, sorry. When he went to Fort Hare in 1947, he was totally apolitical. He wasn't interested in politics this bit. Now, Benjamin Pogrand writes in his book, How Can a Man Die Better?, that in December 1946, Dennis Siwisa visited Sobukwe, and his plan was to spend the weekend with him. Now, Siwisa was very excited about the emerging African nationalism in South Africa at the time, and for him it held a promise of the possibility of democratizing South Africa, and he wanted to have a conversation with Sobukwe about this. But he was so disappointed with Sobukwe's response that he left and didn't spend the weekend with him. He left in complete disgust at Sobukwe. Now, okay, fast forward, 1947, Sobukwe goes to Fort Hare and registers for the courses that I have indicated he registered for. Now, just in case there is doubt about what Pogrand is saying, I must indicate that in an interview with Gail Gerhardt, Sobukwe himself says that up to the point when he went to Fort Hare University, he had no interest in politics. And he says it was his study of native administration which politicized him. So here's what Pogrant says, quote, he decided to study native administration as the study of laws controlling black people was called. In this course, he was confronted with the details of the means whereby blacks were oppressed. It caused him vast shock, end quote. And this is what politicized Sobukwe. Now, native administration, which should have prepared him to control his own people in the interests of the oppressor, had an unintended consequence. It converted Sobukwe into such a fierce freedom fighter that in 1963, B.J. Foster, who was the Minister of Justice in South Africa at the time, dubbed him the most dangerous man in South Africa, and he indicated that he needed a law which would enable him to keep Sobukwe in jail for all time, this side of the grave. That is the unintended consequence which his study of native administration had on him. Now, what did Sobukwe stand for? There are many subheadings we could discuss this question under, but I have selected 11 subheadings under which I would like to discuss what Sobukwe stood for. And I'm deriving these subheadings from the various speeches which he gave. The subheadings are, I would like to talk about where Sobukwe stood in terms of the nature of the South African problem, in terms of the ideological response to that problem, in terms of the totality of the struggle against the existing social order, mental emancipation, the content of the liberation struggle in South Africa, his organizing methods, leadership, his understanding of leadership of the African struggle, his role, the role of education, minority rights, alignment. And alignment is important because at the time when Sobukwe was saying all these things, there was a tussle in global powers, in terms of which some were trying to pull Africa into the side of the West in terms of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then others were trying to pull Africans on the side of the Warsaw Pact in terms of the Soviet Union and all its allies. Now, I would like to discuss what Sobukwe's stance was on all of that, and also then on the notorious question of multiracialism. Now, let's start with the nature of the South African problem. We can glean how Sobukwe read the South African problem from a number of his speeches. Speaking on behalf of the graduating students at Fort Hare on the 21st of October 1949, he made reference to the struggle which was taking place at the Frere Hospital, the struggle by the nurses at the Frere Hospital. And this is what he had to say, I quote, "The battle is on. To me, the struggle at the hospital is more than a question of discipline," and he puts discipline in inverted commas. "It is a struggle between Africa and Europe, between 20th century desire for self-realization and a feudal conception of authority," end quote. Further in the speech, he says, quote again, we see also a new spirit of determination, a quiet confidence, the determination of a people to be free, whatever the cost," end quote. Now, in April 1959, he gave a speech at the launch of the PAC, and this is what he had to say, among other things. I quote again, "White supremacy, under whatever guise it manifests itself, must be destroyed. Now it is our contention that true democracy can be established in South Africa and on the continent as a whole only when white supremacy has been destroyed," end quote. In August, now that speech was in April 1959, in August 1959, he gave a speech titled State of the Nation. And among other things, this is what he had to say, quote, "The struggle in South Africa is part of the greater struggle throughout the continent for the restoration to the African people of the effective control of their land," end quote. What do these statements tell us about how Sobukwe saw the problem in South Africa? One, it seems to me clear that he saw on the one side of the political divide people he referred to as Europeans, and on the other side of the political divide, indigenous people who were struggling for their identity, their self-realization. People who are not familiar with the history of South Africa might wonder why Sobukwe would call white people who lived in South Africa Europeans, and so I must pause and explain that. Until 1959 in South Africa was decorated, public spaces in South Africa were decorated with notices which would say Europeans only and non-Europeans only. Now, when Americans visited South Africa, they had a tendency of getting in where it was marked non-Europeans only. And I'm speaking about white Americans. So this was causing embarrassment, and when they were asked, but why did you come in here? They would say, but that's what the notice says. It says Europeans there and non-Europeans here, and we are not Europeans. This is why we got in here. Now, in order to spare white people of the world from the indignity of using substandard facilities which were reserved for black people, there was a change in terminology in 1959. So the signs which said Europeans only were replaced with signs which said whites only. And signs which said non-Europeans only were replaced with signs, notices which said non-whites only. So in interacting with Sobukwe's choice of words, it is important to keep in mind that white people in South Africa generally saw themselves as Europeans at the time when Sobukwe was saying these things in 1949. Now, by designating themselves as Europeans, white people in South Africa confirmed the thesis that they were foreigners and that their rule of South Africa was therefore foreign domination over indigenous people. We will come back to that point in a moment. The second point I would like to talk to is Sobukwe identified the South African political problem as a situation in which Africans were alienated from themselves. Therefore, he saw their efforts as a struggle for self-realization. He said, we must fight, and I'm quoting, we must fight for freedom, for the right of Africans to call their souls their own. In other words, he was saying, reclaim yourselves as Africans. Now, the struggle for self-realization invites Africans to work towards understanding themselves and their place in the world. As we shall see soon, Sobukwe held the view that unless Africans did this, unless they reclaimed their souls, unless they achieved self-realizations and were self-defining, it was not possible for them to struggle for their emancipation in any meaningful way in South Africa. Sobukwe said, Africans are involved in the struggle to be free, whatever the cost. This is a rather important political consideration in 1949. Sobukwe does not say Africans are struggle for involvement in pre-existing forums in South Africa. I think he says they are struggling to be free. I think it would have been helpful for him to spell out, although he does at a later stage, what freedom exactly means, but the fact that he is not equating, as the 1949 program of action of the ANC was saying, he does not equate freedom with rejecting apartheid is significant. He says black people are struggling to be free. He doesn't say they are struggling to be invited onto the table of the white man. He doesn't say they are struggling in order to reject separate development, but he doesn't mince his words. He says they are struggling to be free. Now, he reasoned that white supremacy, as it defined the South African political landscape, was a serious problem and needed to be destroyed. And I think it is interesting that he uses the word destroyed. He doesn't say it must be accommodated. He doesn't say it must be compromised on. He says it must be destroyed. And then he nails his colors on the mast and declares that the liberation struggle is a struggle for the restoration to the African people of effective control of their land. Significantly, Sobukwe makes no bones about who the land belongs to. Unlike other people who were saying it belongs to everyone who lives in it, Sobukwe is quite clear that it belongs to the Africans. What about the ideological component of his stance? Now, if Sobukwe saw the South African problem, as I have just indicated, what was the ideological response of the Africans supposed to be? First, let us point out that Sobukwe was very alive to the divisions which held black people apart in South Africa. He was alive to the extent to which these divisions mediated any possibility of joint action in trying to address the political problem that South Africa was. But let us recall, that earlier we said he essentially saw the problem of South Africa as a conflict between indigenous people and foreigners. Now, in August 1959, in a speech entitled State of the Nation, he declared, and I quote, "African nationalism is the only liberatory creed that can weld the masses who are members of heterogeneous tribes in a solid, disciplined, and unified fighting force. It is the only creed that can provide them with loyalty higher than that of a tribe and give them formal expression to their desire to be a nation," end quote. Now, this is, in my view, terribly important because, you see, you fast forward to the 21st century, where a significant leader, political leader, dons a T-shirt which is marked 100% Zulu boy. So we are back exactly to the sort of things that in 1959 Sobukwe was trying to remove us from. But I want to suggest that it was quite natural for Sobukwe, because of the way in which he defined the South African problem, it was quite natural for him to posit African nationalism as the response to that problem. Now here I want to pause and lean back on Sam Noluchungu in his book, Changing South Africa. He writes, quote, "The character of the state conditions not only the terms of domination and submission, but also the ideologies and political behavior which challenge and reject it." So once Sobukwe had defined the South African problem in the manner that he defined it, it was inevitable that he would posit African nationalism as a response. And then let's look at the other element, the totality of the struggle. Sobukwe was very conscious of the fact that there were no spaces in South Africa where black people might take refuge from political oppression. In other words, wherever you went, the political oppression would be right there with you. You couldn't hide from it. Sobukwe was very alive to that reality. When he gave his graduation speech in 1949, he was conscious of the fact that to many, the graduation ceremony was not a place to raise the political issues that he raised in that speech. But he argued that, and I quote, "we can no longer pretend that there is a proper place and a proper occasion for politics," end quote. In other words, the struggle for freedom is not something that has a place and a time. It is an imperative which confronts you wheresoever you find yourself as a black person. Let's talk about his views on mental emancipation. Earlier, we pointed out that Sobukwe held the view that Africans can struggle for their liberation in a meaningful way only if they make an effort to understand themselves and their place in the world. He was, moreover, acutely aware of the elaborate ideological apparatuses the regime had called into existence in order to keep black people in their place in inverted commas. Now, in 1959, in a speech titled "The PAC's Case," he stated the following, quote, "The white minority can maintain its continued domination only by perfecting the techniques of control in such a way as to enlist the active cooperation and goodwill of the oppressed." Now, you may remember that last time you asked me about the similarities between Sobukwe and Steve. Now, when you read this, you will immediately recall that one of the celebrated statements Biko made was, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." And we can see now how close that position is to the position which Sobukwe argued in 1959 already. Now, let's go back to Sobukwe. He says, "The techniques include the creation of bodies calculated to maintain and develop the relations of domination the relations of dominating and dominated, as well as to condition the minds of the dominated for the unquestioning acceptance of their role as collaborators in the perpetuation of their own domination." What was his answer to these machinations, which he argued had one purpose only, namely to enlist the natives' cooperation in his or her own oppression? His answer can be found in his 1949 graduation speech, where he quotes Marcus Garvey as follows, quote, "You cannot grow beyond your thoughts. If your thoughts are those of a slave, you will remain a slave. If your thoughts are skin deep, your mental development will remain skin deep," end quote. Therefore, mental liberation was to Sobukwe the starting point of any serious attempt by black people to fight for their emancipation. Significantly, Sobukwe was not content to criticize white people for the way in which they treated black people. His pen was just as sharp in criticizing black people when they became willing partners in their own oppression. And he had the following to say, I quote, "It must be clearly understood that we are not begging the foreign minorities to treat our people courteously. We are calling on our people to assert their personality. We are reminding our people that they are men and women with children of their own and homes of their own, and that just as much as they resent being called Gwetini, Mfana, or Mushimane by us, they must equally resent such terms of address by the foreigner." Now, with reference to the status campaign, Sobukwe had the following to say, "We are reminding our people that acceptance of any indignity, any insult, any humiliation is acceptance of inferiority. They must first think of themselves as men and women before they can ask other people to see them in those terms." end quote. The fact that black people are able and willing to stomach abuse by white people but react violently at any hint, real or imagined, of disrespect by other black people is a form of mental illness. Frantz Fanon wrote the following with reference to Algeria in his book, The Wretched of the Earth. Quote, while the settler or the policeman has the right the lifelong day to strike the native, to insult him, and to make him crawl to him, you will see the native reaching for his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive glance cast on him by another native. The native's last resort is to defend his personality vis-a-vis his own brother. In other words, the anger which they cannot act out on the white man, on the white woman, they act it out on those who look like them. It's a mental disease which we have to deal with. We see in this the misdirected anger of the oppressed African. Hopeless to act out his anger against the oppressor, he or she directs it at those who look like him or her. What Sobukwe was saying then was that it was essential, if the African was going to strive for freedom, to understand that it was possible to direct his or her anger where it correctly belonged rather than direct it against his own people. Now let's talk about the content of the liberation struggle. What exactly would the African be fighting for in struggling for liberation? In embarking on a liberation struggle, what would the African be trying to undo in the social political fabric that South Africa was? Well, we have already hinted a few of these, but let's look at, I'm not going to repeat what we have already said, because a lot of things that we have said indicate what Sobukwe thought we should be struggling for. But let's look at his speech, the PAC case, in which Sobukwe said, quote, the entire economic fabric of South Africa rests on the indispensable pillars of cheap black labor, end quote. This assertion was important not only for the purpose of developing strategies for fighting the system, it was also a pointer in terms of what needed to be eradicated in South Africa. Black cheap labor is one of the things that we would have had to eradicate if we struggled for freedom in a meaningful way in South Africa. In his 1949 graduation speech, he had the following to say, quote, we are seeing today a germination of the seeds of decay inherent in capitalism. We discern the first shoots of the tree of socialism, end quote. Therefore, it is quite clear that in Sobukwe's vision, part of what we would be working towards is a socialist dispensation in South Africa. Now, delivering his inaugural convention of the PAC speech in 1959, he said, economically, we aim at the rapid extension of individual development in order to alleviate pressure on the land, which is what progress means in terms of modern society. We stand committed to a policy guaranteeing the most equitable distribution of wealth. And again, you can see in this a hint that we should be working towards an equitable a society which is economically equitable. And then he says, our problem as we see it is to make a planned economy work within the framework of a political democracy. Now, he continues and criticizes places where socialism had tended to be implemented in a way which undermined democracy. And he says it is possible to have socialism and democracy. Now, we can infer...
The question there, you know?
Yes.
When we speak about things like socialism and capitalism. These are things that came from Western thought. I mean, even socialism, about Karl Max and them, these are white liberals. So, where is the Africanist black thought leaders and the ones that we're supposed to quote? Like, if we're speaking about a Mangaliso Sobukwe, we don't expect to still be dealing with the white liberal politics.
Yeah, well, I don't think one can call Karl Marx a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. Karl Marx was radical. Karl Marx was revolutionary. And to see him as a liberal would be a complete misunderstanding of his works. But the person I'm referring to here is Sobukwe. And what I'm quoting from his speeches is that he himself saw the need for socialism. Now, you see, capitalism evolved historically. It's not an economic arrangement which fell down from heaven. And in fact, capitalism started showing its ugly face in the 12th century. It was around 1143 that the first capitalist revolution took place. But it was crushed, and capitalism as we know it today finally established itself as the dominant world economic order only in the 15th century. Now, whether we like it or not, the fact of the matter is we are confronted by the problems which have been created by capitalism, and we have to find a response to those problems. In a meeting held by BPC and SASO in 1975 in Mafikeng, they thought the response was black communalism. Now, the interesting thing is that the document which they produced, which argued for black communalism, it was called either the Mafikeng Manifesto or the 16-point program. It was banned until recently, and it was banned under what? It was banned under the Suppression of Communism Act, because the government saw it as a form of communism, advocating communism. But you see, Sobukwe is quoting Marcus Garvey. He's quoting a lot of other people. And as you will see, he is alive to the fact that, and I've skipped this quotation in this presentation in the interests of time, but one of the quotations I should have read was where he speaks about the South African political order being supported by the capitalists of the world, and therefore apparently being impregnable, he says. Now, you are not going to succeed in opposing capitalism without taking cognizance of other people who are struggling against capitalism, whether you are African or not. But the point here is that Sobukwe is a leading, and by the way, Kwame Nkrumah as well saw the problem. So a lot of leading African theoreticians saw the need to argue for a certain form, at least, of socialism. In Sobukwe's case, he argued for an Africanist socialism. I was going to move to his methods of organizing. Now, if Africans were divided the way in which Sobukwe says they were, and there's no doubt about it, they were, and by the way, there are even people, if you look at the history of South Africa, even before the emergence of the ANC, there were people who were complaining that the introduction of Christianity to black people has created a problem, because now black people are divided. Some are Lutherans, others are Methodists, others are Roman Catholic Church members, and so over and above the ethnic divisions which we already have, we have now added denominational divisions. And Sobukwe was alive to all of that. Now, if the oppressor had taken control of the minds of black people in the way that Sobukwe had, it would require a high level of organizing skills to galvanize them into one unit, one common unit struggling for their own emancipation. But it would also require a deep understanding on Sobukwe's part of what exactly he was up against. Now, in the PAC case speech, he had the following to say, quote, "We are faced with an overwhelming combination of forces internally in the person of the white ruling minority, and externally in the person of the Western capitalism and international imperialism. Viewed from this agenda alone, the position of the ruling minority appears to be impregnable." What I referred to, I thought I had skipped it, but there you have it. He clearly, therefore, was under no illusion about what the Africans were up against, yet that did not dampen his fighting spirit. In his graduation speech, he categorically said, quote, "The price for freedom is blood, toil, and tears." He's aware of these things, but he says that's the price you have to pay if you want freedom: blood, toil, and tears. Therefore, he understood quite clearly that freedom was not going to be delivered to the African on a silver platter. It would come at a price, and it was essential for the Africans to wrap their heads around that. As Fanon once observed, quote, "You do not turn any society upside down with such a program if you are not decided from the very beginning to overcome all the obstacles that you will come across," end quote. Now, Sobukwe was resolved that it is going to be necessary to overcome all the obstacles. Now, he continued and states, "Because the South African ruling minority is backed by forces of international capitalism and imperialism, it becomes necessary for us to develop an international outlook. However, the lesson of history in the last half century shows that we can only get the moral support and sympathy of friendly people. They can never liberate us." So he is clear that we have to have an international perspective, but we must also be sober-minded and understand that we are our own liberators. We can't rely on other people to free us. He was reconciled, therefore, to the need to mobilize international support for the liberation of Africans, but he understood equally that Africans are their own liberators. He argued that in pursuing their liberation, Africans must be guided by the quote, "by the logic of the African situation and the fundamental long-term interests of the African millions, rather than aping this or that country," end quote. But what was Sobukwe's practical day-to-day organizational strategy? He took the view that people must be organized in a manner which builds their confidence. In other words, you mustn't organize people in such a way that they lose and then get demoralized. You must organize them in a way which builds up their confidence. He says that means the quote starts with, "The principal aim of our campaign is to get ourselves arrested." Now you know that is the past campaign. He says the principal aim of our campaign is to get ourselves arrested, get our women remaining at home. This means nobody will go to work. Industry will come to a standstill and the government will be forced to accept our terms. And once we score that victory, there will be nothing else we will not be able to tackle. But we must know quite clearly, now that our struggle is an unfolding one campaign is going to be leading to another in a never-ending stream until we win our independence, end quote. What about leadership? Sobukwe says, thus it is, as South African history so ably illustrates, that whenever Europeans cooperate with African movements, they keep on demanding checks and counter-checks, guarantees and the like, with the result that they stultify and retard the movement of the African. And the reason is, of course, that they are consciously or unconsciously protecting their sectional interests. We want to make the African people conscious of the fact that they have to win their own liberation and rely on themselves to carry out the relentless and determined struggle. Sobukwe accordingly believed that Africans must themselves struggle and direct the struggle for their own emancipation. Did that make him anti-white? In his graduation speech, he says, quote, I wish to make it clear that we are anti-nobody. We are pro-African. We are not anti-anybody. We are pro-African, end quote. But his declaration about not being anti-anyone did not convince the liberals who continued accusing him of racism. His response was very interesting, and he says, quote, your actions speak so loud, your words cannot be heard. So you keep on telling us that you are not racist, but your actions point the other way. What about the role of education? How did he see the role of education? Now, in the foreword to Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Richard Scholl has the following. Now, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a book by Paulo Freire, but the foreword is written by Richard Scholl. He says, sorry, quote, education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the young generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with their reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. Now, Sobukwe was alive to all of this, and in his speech at Fort Hare, he said Fort Hare should become to Africans what Stellenbosch is to white people, a barometer of black thinking. I will skip the rest of the stuff there and move over to the next question. Maybe I can skip that too. I just want to go to the concluding remarks, which I think we should try and tie in what we've been saying with what is happening in South Africa. Now, at the beginning of the discussion, I said we are facing several problems in South Africa today, which must raise serious questions about the quality of our freedom. I said it is easy in the face of these problems to glorify apartheid, which we have come from. And as some people would say, it was better in Egypt. So there's a hankering for the past. Now, this is not an isolated phenomenon. I've referred to Frantz Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth. He discusses a similar situation in the context of Algeria, where Algerians were beginning to say, quote, it was not worthwhile then our becoming independent, end quote, because they were seeing the same difficulties and sometimes even worse difficulties under conditions of freedom than was the case before they became liberated. Now, when we hanker after the past, that is exactly what we are saying, that it was not worthwhile becoming free. The narrow overthrow of apartheid was not worthwhile. I have even heard it said, in many respects, our lives were better under apartheid than they are presently. And any honest person can understand how easy it is to fall into this trap. But I want us to remind one another of some uncomfortable home truths. One, we did not go away from South Africa in 1994 and come back in 2019 in order to find South Africa being the mess that it is. We were here when it became the mess. It's not as if we were away. Two, we saw how day by day things were falling out of control in South Africa, and we turned a blind eye to all of it. It's not taking us by surprise. Siyibonile yenzeka lento. Three, we were in South Africa in July 1985 when Marquis Khosana was necklaced to death. We were here in South Africa, we saw it, and we know who necklaced her. We didn't forget this in 1994 when we voted. We were aware who had killed Marquis Khosana. We voted knowing fully well who was responsible for killing Marquis Khosana. We were in South Africa when this gruesome manner of killing political opponents was spread throughout the length and breadth of the country. Siyibonile, it's not something which took us by surprise. We witnessed it. And when we voted in 1994, we knew who did all of that. We were in South Africa in April 1986 when Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, in a speech she gave at Mansfield Krugerstop, declared, quote, with our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country, end quote. We heard Winnie say this. She didn't say it after 1994. She said it, as I say, in 1986. When we voted in 1994, we knew this. We were in South Africa in November 1997 when Murphy Murobe was quoted to have told the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that when Winnie Mandela said this, she was understood to be referring to informers and black policemen and or women. We heard him say this, but we had the experience of knowing that this method was not used against Izimpimpi. It was used against political opponents of the ANC. We were here, we witnessed that. I'm straining to see, to even imagine which policeman was necklaced in South Africa. Njengoba uMefu Murobe ethi it was directed at black policemen. Now, we heard him say this. We were around and we knew that Marquis Khosana's killers subsequently apologized. You know they did. They said, we are sorry, we thought Marquis is an informer, but we know she's not an informer. But it was too late, they had already killed her. When we voted in April 1994, we knew the relationship between the United Democratic Front and the ANC. It was not a secret, we knew it. We knew a good number of top UDF leaders who ranked high on the ANC's candidate list in 1994. Notwithstanding that, we voted the way in which we did. We were here in South Africa in 2003 when the Director of Public Prosecutions, Bulelani Ngcuka, decided not to prosecute Jacob Zuma, although he said there was a prima facie case of corruption against him. We were here, we heard him, we saw it. We were here in 2007 when Tony Yengeni was freed from prison after serving only 4 months of a 4-year prison sentence. We were here when senior ANC members went and received him when he was released from Pollsmoor prison. We were in South Africa here in 2007 when load shedding started. We didn't go away and come back and found the country was captured in load shedding. We saw it starting. We were here when the Scorpions were disbanded in 2008, despite what we all thought was a good job they were doing against organized crime. We were here in 2009 when Shabir Sheikh was released from prison after serving 2 years and 4 months of a 15-year sentence. We saw all of that. We were here in 2009 when Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions Joseph Mphe dropped all charges against Jacob Zuma. We saw that. We were here. Besingahambanga. We were here in 2011 when Jackie Silebi was freed after serving less than 250 days of a 15-year jail sentence. Besikhona la ekhaya. We were here in 2017 when Bathabile Dlamini made a public statement that all of us in the ANC NEC have our smallanyana skeletons. We heard her, but we continued voting the way in which we were voting. We were here in 2021 when Smart Ngonyama said he did not join the liberation struggle in order to be poor. We were here in 2021 when Jacob Zuma was freed after serving 2 months of a 15-month sentence. We were here when criminals took control of our streets and our living spaces. Besingahambanga. It happened in our presence. We were here when the criminal justice system failed to protect us against criminals. And we were here when each and every one of the things that we are complaining about today happened. What is my point? It is simple and straightforward. Before we find fault with freedom, before we find fault with liberation, before we say it was not worthwhile to be free, before we say it was better under apartheid, let us sit back and look at the role we ourselves have played in promoting the rot that we are now complaining about. Let us sit back and truthfully consider all the things we could have done to prevent or stop the rot, but which we did not do. It is for this purpose that I have thought it necessary to invite us to remember uSobukwe, not because I think we should necessarily vote PAC, but because I think his views could have helped us control the ANC and prevent it from running our country down. When ANC politicians were stealing from us, running the country down, when ANC politicians enriched themselves, we could have held up to them the words of Sobukwe, quote, "True leadership demands complete subjugation of self, absolute honesty, integrity and uprightness of character, courage and fearlessness, and above all, a consuming love for one's people," end quote. What am I saying? I am saying it is not freedom which has created our problems. We must take responsibility for all the things which have gone wrong in South Africa. We allowed them to flourish. The people we voted for never pretended to be anything other than they are. They were always clear. We voted for them fully knowing what they are capable of. When, therefore, the path of freedom becomes steep, the solution is not to return to slavery. The solution is to make the correct political decisions moving forward. Ndiyabulela.
Enkosi kakhulu Tata MANDLA. Thank you to the viewers for tuning in to the Robert Maungaliso Sobukwe lecture, and we thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. We'll see you again next time.
Who are you when all you were has been diluted by lies and white lines cancelling out all that which has been written of your history? Why do you look at yourself as a mystery? Doesn't the sun shine because you open your eyes? Doesn't the moon stay situated within the same stars your DNA sparkles off? Your spirit knows that surely corner into it off. Buza MOYA so you may return to being well off. Because spiritually you are rich, yet your ancestors cry because you are out of reach. But yours is to command all elements while God takes inspiration from the very mirror she looked at to become. Remember who you are and never finish just when they think that with you they are done.